Maps of the inner world and maps of the outer world are equally important. If you do not have a good map of the outer world and you drive your car into a cement wall and die, the maps of the inner world are not going to be as useful. At the same time, if you successfully navigate the outer maps and create all the money you want, all the cultural rank that you want, all the possessions and things that you want, but you do not know who you are, you cannot enjoy them, your life has no purpose, and you're lost in the illusion of the material world, they mean nothing, right? And so both extremes are problematic. Now we understand that a good map of the outer world is important, right? Science is our best map of the outer world, and it has facilitated enormous change and development over the last few hundred years since the idea of correlating measurements and numbers has allowed us to create more and more accurate maps about the outer reality. What many of us don't realize, though, is that these are maps of reality. They are not reality, right? Gravity is a map that successfully predicts the future most of the time. And you need finer and finer levels of that map to predict more and more detailed areas of what we will find. And a map is at its heart useful for predicting the future, for allowing us to partner with what will be more gracefully, more successfully, with more fun. If we can predict that a car moving in this direction will continue to move in this direction, and so we get out of the way, it's more fun than having a collision. If we can predict that the stock market is going to go up and we invest and then we sell high, it's more fun than predicting that the stock market will go down and losing all of that money. And so maps are useful for predicting the future so that we can partner more harmoniously with reality. But it's also important to understand that anything that exists in language, any thought, any words, are not real. They are maps that help us to relate to reality. And this is important to understand because most of us have confused the map of reality with reality. We believe that the thoughts in our own head are real. Now, just very briefly deconstructing that illusion, we can look at a single finger, right? And we all know that the finger is real. This is a finger. We all know that. Or do we? Finger, binger, hinger. Are those this mass of energy here? No, they're a sound. They're a sound. And the sound is a symbol for the finger. Or is it? The sound that we arbitrarily create is a symbol for a thought, not the finger. If I say, what is a finger? You reference the thoughts that you have around the word finger. You can say a finger is an appendage, a pointy object at the end of a hand. But are any of those real? Or are those just a bunch of symbols that relate to other symbols? Right? What is hand? What is sand? What is panned? Right? It's just other symbols. What is a hand? Well, it's a thing that is at the end of an arm. But is it a thing? Right? Well, it's that pointy thing. What is the pointy thing? Well, it's a series of molecules and chemicals and blood, but are those sounds actually real, or are they symbols for other thoughts? And why is it an appendage as opposed to an interruption in space? You see? Space here, and this is interrupting the space. Why is it an appendage rather than an interruption? Because the thought is different. Why is it a pointy object instead of the thing that pushes buttons? Right? It's just a different thought. Right? And why is it an appendage of the hand rather than part of the hand? And is the finger any different than the body? Why is it differentiated? If the finger cannot exist without the body, and the body cannot exist without the ancestors, and the ancestors cannot exist without the planet, and the planet cannot exist without the universe, why is the idea of a finger separate from the idea of the universe? Because we created the symbol separate. We've drawn the map in our mind as separate points of the whole. But are they separate if they cannot exist without one another? So it's a shaky set of mental maps at best. And if we say, well, what is a finger made of? It's made of these molecules and that molecules. And we say, well, what are those molecules made of? Well, they're made of atoms. Well, you're getting into trouble when an atom moves faster than you can say the symbol for atom, which is atom, right? So you say a word, and all thought is linked to words. It is impossible to think a single thought without the symbolic use of language, without invoking symbols called words. Every thought is constructed in the symbolic language of words. So you cannot think faster than you can compose words. So you say, yes, I can. Right? Takes a second. But the atom has moved 1,000 times faster than you could think the thought about the atom. Well, that should provide a clue that you're not dealing with reality, you're dealing with ideas about reality. But what happens when every idea you have about reality is out of date? Because if you say the atom spun, right? The atom spun counterclockwise, clockwise, and the atom has already done 10,000 revolutions before you can think the thought of doing one revolution. And you can't catch up to the atom because it's going so much faster than you can think. If the atom is going 1,000 times faster than you can think the word atom is going 1,000 times faster, you're 1,000 times behind, right? If I say the car is there, and by the time I say the car is there, it has sped along the highway. 1,000 times faster and is no longer there, do my words still accurately represent reality? Do the symbols of reality mean anything if reality is 1,000 times ahead of the symbol? Well, those are just atoms. What about the movements of subatomic particles that are faster than the movements of atoms? Well, if there's 1 billion subatomic particles in my finger and every one of them is moving 1,000 times faster than I can say subatomic particles, I'm not dealing with reality. I'm dealing with vague abstract ideas about reality composed with symbols that are so out of date by the time they are uttered that they have very little to do with reality. And so you can drill this in a variety of different ways. I've had this conversation for literally hours, exploring the gap between the symbol, words, and the thoughts and images that the words symbolize. So words are sounds that symbolize thoughts and images, which symbolize an underlying reality that is going much faster than we can say the words or symbolize them, right? So the words are not reality. They're symbols for thoughts, and the thoughts are not reality. They're symbols for patterns of energy, right? And we can say they're reality, but we've never met them. If they're going 10,000 times faster than the speed of thought, we've never met reality. But of course, we pretend it's all real, right? Science is real. Science is just a very good map. It's a very good set of sounds that relates to a very good set of thoughts that can predict very slow areas of reality, right? It can't keep up with a single subatomic particle. Before you get the subatomic Microsoft set up, the subatomic particle has moved 10,000 times. And if you capture a frozen image, here it was. Well, if the best that we could do in order to give real-time 24-hour news is arrive 10,000 years too late, right? Something happens, and the CNN Action News arrives 10,000 years too late to take a photograph and document what's happening. It's already 10,000 years in the past. If by the time we say subatomic particle, it's moved 10,000 times, right? What are we doing, right? We're clearly dealing in metaphor. We're dealing in symbol. So the real question is it useful? And it is. It is. Particularly with long habits in outer form, long habits, like gravity has been around for a long time, and we have every reason to believe that things will keep moving towards larger things, which is gravity's habit. You know, but for any of us who have settled on a particular tea, right? I like Earl Grey tea. But it goes in phases, right? For years I've drunk Earl Grey tea, and then I'm time for a change, right? I'm time for a change. And yet, you know, many earthworms have lived and died, you know. Thousands and thousands of generations of earthworms have lived and died before I changed my habit of drinking Earl Grey tea. Since we do not know exactly why many of the universal habits that we have observed over time to the best of our ability using the symbol of language, we do not know why they emerged. I mean, we don't even know why the universe emerged. We could just say that the universe has had a habit of existing for a very long time and has had a number of personality characteristics during that period that seem relatively constant, right? But might the universe decide to have a different flavor of tea at some point, right? Well, if it does, we're not going to stop it, right? Any more than the earthworm is going to stop me from changing the flavor of tea I want to drink that year. So maps are very good to the extent that they allow us to predict the future and thus collaborate with the future to create more of what we want. But having understood that our very best maps of outer reality are all 10,000 metaphorical years late, right? Are all incomplete because no matter how clearly we say a map, there are always anomalies. There's always anomalies, and we don't have room in our minds. We don't have room on the pages of our minds to draw a map that shows all of the anomalies, because the map would have to be as big as reality to show all the anomalies in reality. And we can't keep up with a single subatomic particle in a single atom in a single finger. We're 10,000 years too late, right? Relatively speaking. So what of the inner maps? What are the inner maps and how are they equally as useful? Well, we start with the sphere, the one, the whole, where it all began. And we understand that every piece of the whole is equally important for the whole to be whole. Now, given a value lens, we cannot say that every piece of the whole is equally important for joy or equally important for X person. But we can say that every piece of the whole is equally important for the whole to exist. And since the only thing that creates the illusion of the pieces are symbols called language, since the pieces don't exist until the mind creates a map of symbols that create the illusion of those pieces, since a finger does not exist unless a mind correlates a sound, finger, with an idea of a shape and the idea of a distinct object, right? We say this is the pointy bit. The bit is the idea that it's distinct, and we can say, well, it's definitely distinct because we can chop this point off with a knife. But how long does it last as a point, right? Is it a point with blood in it if the blood bleeds out almost immediately? A finger is supposed to be able to move, right? Can it still move if it's chopped off? Right? A finger is supposed to be allow you to hold things. Can you hold things with this finger when it's chopped off? And the finger is supposed to be this color. Can it retain this color if it's chopped off, or does it quickly turn black? Right? It's supposed to be living, but if the microorganisms consume it, is it still living? Right? It's not clear that it can be a finger if it's removed from the things that make it a finger, the blood, the oxygenate, the oxygen cycle, the heart, right, that all make it a finger. So if it's inextricably connected to all of these things, then how can it really be a separate object? It's easy. We just create an idea in our mind of a separate object, right? We take the whole pizza and we
cut it up into pieces. And we say, this is piece number 1. Well, why isn't it piece number 3? Well, I'm starting here. Why? Well, I've got to start somewhere. This is piece number 1. This is piece number 2. And a lot of it is arbitrary, but it is still very useful. It's still very useful to communicate, and it's very useful to understand the idea of gravity because it allows me to predict, right, that I need to close my hand as I let go of this hand. It's a useful prediction. Now, mythology takes the whole and divides them into archetypes. These archetypes have a name: gods, goddesses, forces, right? Earth, air, fire, and water is a typical Western archetypal way of taking the entire field of matter and divvying them up into quarters. The Chinese, on the other hand, say earth, air, fire, and water, wood, and metal, right? A little bit more distinction. Now, the more distinction your map has, the more data it reveals. So if you have a 4K map, meaning you have 4,000 pixels per unit of space, then you've got more detail than if you've got a 300 pixel per unit of space map, right? So it's more blurry. The less pixels you have, the less units of data per unit of space, the more blurry the image. On the other hand, since you can't keep up with a single subatomic particle in a single atom in a single finger, you don't want too much data or you get behind. Before you can think it through, you just get lost in the data. Now, archetypes go off in all directions, right? Archetypes go off in all directions, and they create polarities, right? For example, the lover and the warrior are two polarities. But they also support one another. If you do not protect your lover with a strong boundary, you may no longer be a lover, right? They're complementary. If you have nothing that you love, you will not fight. So they are interdependent polarities. The polarity is created in the illusion of the mind. They are interdependent. Nobody fights when they don't care about living and dying. In other words, so there's a care, there's a love that is the basis for every fight. And usually people fight about what they care about most: their identity, their ego, their way of being. Identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And if another identity, another pattern, comes into our land and changes the pattern, then we lose our identity. Our I loses the pattern it's familiar with. So we will often fight to maintain the ego pattern, even if it's not a very good pattern, right? We were mildly depressed and bored and resentful, and somebody came into our life and threatened to disrupt all of that, and we said, no, this is our way of life, and we're going to fight for it. So we fight for what we love, right? And we protect what we love. So what we love does not exist without a certain amount of protection that is granted by the warrior, and yet they appear to be opposites, right? We have the wise one and the fool. The wise one and the fool. And yet, how much of knowledge is known and how much is invisible? Right? How much knowledge is known and how much is invisible? So the fool acknowledges that they know nothing, which is 10,000 times more accurate. Right? 99.99% of reality lies in the domain of the unknown and in the unknown unknown. Most of the unknown, we don't know that we don't know it. Reality is vastly bigger than the known conscious mind can encapsulate. And so it is the fool that searches in the vaster area, whereas the expert, whereas the wise one focuses in what is known, which is the very tiny area. So the fool is wiser than the wise one, right? There are these parallels and polarities and paradoxes that exist because we're dealing with one great circle. And if you travel left and left and left and left, you come back from the right. And if you travel down and down and down and down and down, you come up to the top, right? If you carry any one direction in relationship with a large spherical shape, you eventually make a full revolution and you come back where you left, but from the opposite direction. You set off thinking that freedom is the most important thing for happiness, and then you come back to realizing that control is the most important thing for happiness, and then you set off again, right? Any time in any direction that you set off, if you follow it as an extreme, you will come back to where you were, right? If you just follow that course, understanding that reality is circular. Right? So the archetypes are a map of psychological polarities and psychological directions. You're here, and right over here you could move towards the warrior, and over here you could move towards the lover, but of course if you continue with the lover devoted and passionately, you will become a warrior to protect that which you love, right? Right? If you keep going to war, you will look deeper and deeper for something you love, maybe money, maybe identity, right? But you will end up with love. Now, these are very abstract ideas, and so most cultures are intelligent enough to invent a pictorial map through stories of all the different directions and where they lead. The directions that lead down, Hades and the underworld, the directions that lead up, right? And of course, they intersect. If you look at any story, there's a cycle that goes on. Right? You start off up and you end up down. And you start off down and you end up up. And what's important is not where you start, but that you're able to make a full revolution. If you take breathing, for example, as one of those cycles of life, right? Wherever you are, if you continue it, if you're breathing out and you breathe all the way out, and then you breathe all the way in, you've completed a cycle, and then it's all the way out and all the way in. Now, the only destruction, the only death in that cycle is if you stop at an extreme and try to go deeper into the extreme. If you exhale all the breath you have and then do even more, you have that extreme. If you go into debt and spend all the money you have and then go deeper and deeper into debt, right, the life cycle collapses for that organism. But if you go into debt and pay it all back, you go into debt and pay it all back, or if you make money and spend money, or if you spend money and make money, as long as you stay in balance with the cycle, you'll end up in a sustainable relationship with life. Now, because it's very difficult to make sense of whether to connect to joy more today, or whether to connect more with sadness, or whether to connect more with beauty, or whether to recognize more of the ugliness, the gods and goddesses in any healthy cultural framework stand as archetypal figures around the paradoxes, around the opposites, right? And we are somewhere in the middle, inside the circle, and as we go through our life, we may be a little bit more on this side, right? And that may be part of a cycle. It's like that. Now, the grace is in the center. Stillness, the grace is in the center. But life is a cycle around something. The earth goes around the sun, right? We move around the center. We're not still in the center. We are a cycle in relationship with the center. Now, the deities, the maps of reality that are useful, guide you in a relationship with these paradoxical energies, these archetypal energies, right? Maybe we spend some time in the feminine, and then we spend some time in the masculine. Maybe we spend some time at war, and then we spend some time at love, right? We spend some time in discipline, and we spend some time in play. We spend some time exhaling, we spend some time inhaling. We spend some time making money, we spend some time spending money. And it is a cycle. Now, this collapses somewhat in the literalization. I would say there are two dangers in Western culture. One is the collapse of the panoply of useful directions. It's important to understand that without cruelty, you cannot be kind. For example, if you've got a bum brother who borrows endlessly and doesn't repay, and why should he work, of course, if you're going to loan him money endlessly, right? If you allow someone to exploit any extreme within you, for example, the dogma of kindness, then you're also supporting the dogma of greed, right? If you do energy that way that doesn't come back, your kindness is enabling greed. So the cycle, there's always a balance in the system in one way or another. But if you lose everything and you're the hardworking and intelligent one, and they're the lazy and the dishonest one, where's the benefit in that, right? So when you collapse circular models of reality in which you move from one to the other, and instead divide the circle in half and pretend that one side is good and the other is bad, which is a very crude mental map, well, then, of course, you want to be the good one. You want to be the kind one, but not the selfish one. And yet, if you are not selfish enough to accumulate energy, how can you give it? Right? And if you give away all of your energy and have nothing and give it to lazy and unbalanced people, how can you be kind to yourself or give more, right? And so you have two threats to this tapestry
this map of the inner reality. The first is polarization, the pretense that one in its absolute form is better than the other, that giving is always better than receiving. Well, if everyone did that, no, you couldn't give, because everyone would be trying to, I'd say, here, take this, and you'd say, no, 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 take that, and someone else would come in and say, no, 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 take that, and you'd spend all your time arguing. So if you really believe that giving is better than taking, then nobody can give, because everyone has to give and nobody should take, right? So your model falls apart. The other collapse is into literalization, right? To say that, Apollo that represents these characteristics, or Demeter that represents these characteristics, or Mary or Jesus that represent these characteristics, that are representing an energy, a direction, are literal and historical, and should be literal and historical. That they're not real if they aren't concrete. And so, because they're important, they are or were concrete in physical form. So now we're confusing the inner reality and the outer reality out of a chauvinism, because the first crime is the idea that the inner reality is less valuable than the outer reality. It never is. Anytime you cut the circle in half, they are two equal halves. And because the whole and the synergies that emerge out of any whole are exponentially more valuable, more potentiated, more potent than either half, the synergy, the possibility field that emerges out of the whole is so much bigger than the possibility field that emerges out of half of the whole. Right? That the whole is always more important than the half, and so you need a paradigm, you need a map of reality that honors both halves, because if you do not honor both halves, in other words, if you exist in a dumb culture that thinks that men are better than women, or that women are better than men, if you take that extreme to the extreme, you've got to treat men very well and ignore women. But if you do that, the mating phenomena doesn't go very well, and the synergy of a child never emerges, and the species dies. If you think that management is more important than employees, and so the employees are treated badly, and so they say, fuck you, I'm not going to work for you, the manager quickly realizes that without anyone or anything to manage, they have zero value. On the other hand, if you think that the employees are more valuable than the manager, and so they spend money and ask for wages, and then the company goes bankrupt because there's no profit. Well, right? If you think that spiritual things are more important than material things, because you've divided it that way, and so you get your crystals and do your meditation, and then you're thrown out of your house because you can't pay the rent, well, it's a lot harder to do your meditation on the sidewalk than it is inside a nice meditation room that takes earning money to facilitate, right? And so we have these odd splits in a faulty map created by an ignorant culture. But in reality, the inner is always as valuable as the outer, and the outer is always as valuable as the inner. The male is always as valuable as the female. If you doubt that, if you say that males are 3 times more valuable than females. Well, where did the males come from? Where's all this valuable material emerging from? It's emerging from the female. So the female must be more valuable if it's the source of the male. Right? I mean, the golden goose is more valuable than 1 golden egg. And so the math always breaks down when you try and make a case that any half of reality is absolutely more valuable than any other half. And yet cultural phenomena, spiritual culture, New Age culture, it's all love and light, and no, we don't want anything negative. It's all, or materialistic culture, it's all about the money, and who cares if you feel like shit while you're making it and spending it and dying and burying. I mean, all of these extremes break down. But what we have is a monomyth, the idea that there's only one, which creates a problem. And then we've divided the one to favor certain traits over the other, and that's a problem. And then we've said it's all literal historical fact, and that's a problem, right? And what we need to do in order to move towards grace is to understand that every archetypal energy is supported by every other archetypal energy. It's in tension, like in a wheel with spokes. You want a nice bicycle ride. You have equal spokes with equal tension going in all directions. And that's a good ride. Right? That's a smooth ride. That's a graceful ride. If we understand that our ambition is to find a balanced relationship with each of our archetypes in tension, and we may be starting out in an imbalanced place, and so we spend a little bit more time in this area and a little less time in this area, based on where we're starting from. If we've taken a deep exhale into grief, it may be time for joy. Or we may need to go deeper into the grief and expel it before we inhale again. But life is a cycle. It is billions and billions and billions of cycles, billions and billions and billions of circles that are all interconnected. And we harmonize with those cycles, or we create friction and dis-ease with those cycles as our maps are either whole or incomplete. Right? But the map is never real. The map is never real. We're searching for a relay, a healthy, a balanced, a graceful relay with our inner reality and with our outer reality, neither of which is more important, both of which are interconnected.